Hey everybody, it's Dr. Gilchrist. Welcome to week 5 of Drugs and Behavior. Now, this week and week 6 are going to be a little different than the previous weeks. You have fewer chapters to read. And in this particular case, you're largely going to be focusing on the lecture notes here and also the documentary that I've asked you to watch this week, the documentary Bigger, Stronger, Faster. This documentary was made in the late 2000s, and additionally, it is free on YouTube. Now, initially, when you start to watch this documentary, you're going to think it's largely about wrestling and steroids. And while it certainly is about that, it's about a lot of other things as well. Things that you might find pretty interesting. There are going to be some content warnings. So when I give you the link, do be aware that there is going to be use of some language, particularly ableist language, but I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So this week, we're going to talk about anabolic androgenic steroids, and we're going to talk about treatments for mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder. But today we're going to talk about anabolic steroids. And we're first going to start by talking about the background and the history of anabolic steroids, as well as their pharmacology. And again, my reminder to watch the documentary, Bigger, Stronger, Faster. And I will be sending you, you should have received that link in your email for the documentary on YouTube, and it's free. So we're going to start by talking about the background and the history of anabolic steroids. So it's probably not uncommon at this point to watch people who play sports professionally or play them for the Olympics, and you will definitely find that many of these players are taking performance-enhancing substances, which are sometimes referred to as doping agents. And to be very clear, none of this is really all that new. Use of very specific foods or drugs for performance enhancement actually goes all the way back to Greek and Roman athletes who were consuming various natural substances to basically have increased energy, strength, and endurance. There are a different variety of doping agents that are available, but one particular group that we're going to spend our time on are anabolic androgenic steroids. These are steroid hormones that increase muscle mass, hence why we call them anabolic, and they also have masculinizing or testosterone-like properties, hence why they also are technically androgenic. We're largely going to call them anabolic steroids, but all anabolic steroids are actually androgenic. So these are performance-enhancing steroid hormones. As we've said, they increase muscle mass, which is why they're referred to as anabolic, and they have masculinizing properties, hence they're called androgenic. Now, part of the reason that we're talking about this particular class of drugs in a drugs and behavior class is because there is evidence that these can be abused by some users, and they can produce an addiction-like dependence. But before we get to all of that, we need to learn a little bit more about anabolic steroids. So here are some pretty common anabolic androgenic steroids. So notice that a lot of them have the word testosterone in them. Additionally, they do have a variety of different trade names or street names, but more importantly, take a look at the route of administration. Most of these are going to be orally taken, injected, and then a few are put in a topical gel or a skin patch. But notice that a good chunk of these have the word testosterone in their name. And this is going to be very important because anabolic steroids look like testosterone. Now, most of these are going to be injected intramuscularly. So we're not going intravenous, we're not going all the way into a vein, and we're not going subcutaneously just under the skin. We are going right into the muscle. The ones that we inject are formulated for depot injection. That basically means that they're going to go bind to those depot areas of our body that are pretty much open to all comers. And remember that it takes a longer time to clear drugs from depots. So this means that they can stay potent from a few days all the way up to several weeks, 3 weeks, depending on the steroid. Now, all of these compounds, as you can see here, are structurally related to testosterone. And this is and testosterone is the principal androgen that is produced by the testes. But generally, because we want more of the anabolic effects rather than the masculinizing effects, the chemical modifications are that you're seeing here are all designed to enhance their anabolic potency. Generally, oral steroids, so going back to this list, quite a few of them are taken orally. We do have to worry about that first pass metabolism through the gastrointestinal tract and then that first pass metabolism in the liver. Oral steroids are basically designed to minimize this problem so that there's still a sufficient amount of bioavailability of steroids to basically pass throughout the body. So the important thing to note here is that they all look like testosterone. So here you can kind of see the core structure of all testosterone-related steroids, and just notice for a variety of these, they all look very similar. So let's talk a little bit about the history of anabolic steroids. Now, generally, the United States really didn't know about these until about 1954. So in 1954, the World Weightlifting Championship was held in Vienna. And the Cold War is going on at this time. So World War II is over. We're kind of in a Cold War with the Soviet Union at the time. And up until 1953, the Americans had beaten the Soviet team. But 1954 is when that started to change. The Soviet team actually beat the Americans in 1953 and 1954. And basically, some of the team physicians went out for some entertainment, and basically it was spilled that the physician for the Soviet Union team basically confided that his team was using testosterone. Now, this is reported a little bit differently in Bigger, Stronger, Faster. So some say it was a coach, some say it was a physician. But basically, the critical person here is Dr. John Ziegler. He is the American physician. He basically started to experiment with testosterone, but he really didn't like the masculinizing androgenic side effects. So he basically expressed to a pharmaceutical company that we needed more anabolic compounds and less androgenic compounds. So basically, we end up getting Dianabol, which is an oral compound that has enhanced anabolic properties. And so it was tested out, and they got really good results. So basically, once this happened, pharmaceutical companies really started cranking out anabolic steroids with fewer androgenic properties to basically enhance that athletic performance. And strength athletes basically started to think that steroids were the only way to reach that highest level of achievement. By 1969, Track and Field News is publishing an article called Steroids, Breakfast of Champions. Now, these substances were readily available to athletes from various physicians as well as pharmacists, and they would give athletes these without requiring a prescription. In fact, there was a 1995 Sports Illustrated poll of almost 200 individuals who were either in the Olympics or they wanted to be in the Olympics. And basically, all of these individuals were offered a scenario to use a banned performing enhancing substance, and they knew they wouldn't get caught, but they would guarantee victory in every competition over the next 5 years. About half of the respondents said that they would take it. Now, so you're kind of seeing that we're getting this idea, well, if you want to get better with your strength performance and your athletics performance, this is something that you absolutely need to take. And as I kind of mentioned, the Cold War really played a role in this as well. In addition to the Soviet Union, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, so post-World War II and pre 1989, Germany was divided into the Western side and the Eastern side. East Germany was aligned with the Soviets, and West Germany was aligned with countries like the United States and Britain and so on. So the German Democratic Republic basically started giving anabolic steroids to their athletes in the 1960s, and the most commonly used one was oral turinabol. It has a really long chemical name that I am not going to be able to read without tripping over it, so know that it's oral turinabol. And basically, they actually ended up finding that this particular oral compound provided a lot of success for female athletes who won a lot of Olympic and world championships. So what you're looking at here is the a former East German female shot putter, and basically underwent about 11 weeks of anabolic steroid treatment. And what you can see, so here is the distance. So for those who don't know, shot put is a track and field event. You get a very heavy metal ball, you spin around, you hold it up by your ear, you spin around several times, and then you try to see how far you can throw it. And basically what you can kind of see is that prior to taking the anabolic steroids, the shot putter is doing pretty well, but you can see that the best they're getting is dangerously close to about 18 meters. Then we have our 11-week period of anabolic steroids, and basically by the time that this shot putter is done with the treatment, they are doing well over 19 meters, which is very impressive. Now, again, this is going on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, but it's really beginning in the 80s where it really starts to hit home what is going on. So what you're looking at here is an actual image from the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, South Korea. The person right here at the very front is Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was a Canadian sprinter. The other person to kind of keep in mind is Carl Lewis, who represents the United States, and he's right here. So notice that Ben Johnson has a pretty substantial lead over all of the other athletes. And he was a world record setter in the 100-meter dash, and they basically found out he had been taking steroids. In particular, he had been taking stanozolol. Johnson was basically stripped of his Olympic gold medal. It was then given to Carl Lewis, and you will hear from both of them, particularly Carl Lewis, in Bigger, Stronger, Faster. And then more recently, and this is something that kind of really came into play in the 90s and the early 2000s in Major League Baseball, San Francisco had an enterprise called the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, and they basically were reported to have provided anabolic steroids to a number of very famous athletes, including Barry Bonds. For those who do not know, Barry Bonds is the Major League Baseball career leader in home runs per season and his total home runs. Although, because he has because it was revealed that he had steroid use, there is an asterisk by that record because it was not obtained naturally. And basically, there was the 2013 balloting for the Baseball Hall of Fame, And there were several people, including Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Sammy Sosa, all of whom have been reported to use anabolic steroids, and none of them have been sent to the Hall of Fame. And I believe that that is also true for Mark McGwire. So there were increasing reports of anabolic steroid use, not just in professional sports, but colleges and high schools. And there were practical guides for anabolic steroid use, such as the Underground Steroid Handbook, the Anabolic Reference Guide, and basically in 1991, we get the Anabolic Control Act through Congress. And basically there were 27 specific steroid preparations that were basically made Schedule III controlled substances, basically meaning that you could not use these without prescription. And these substances are banned by many different sports organizations, the NCAA, the International Olympic Committee, the NFL, the NBA, and the MLB. Now, to be fair, that doesn't mean that people aren't using other substances that we haven't heard about. However, those particular substances are banned. Now, let's talk a little bit about the recreational use of steroids. So, anabolic androgenic steroids are still available from various websites without a prescription. And this is going to be more likely than not used by men in particular because the media, especially when the Marvel movies came out, and just in the 80s and the 90s, movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, the popularity of professional wrestling and things like that, there's this image of masculinity as being very muscular. And basically, a recent web-based survey found that improving physical appearance was rated just as important as increasing strength was for using anabolic steroids. So it's not just about strength, it's about how you look. Now, studies on the prevalence have generally yielded an overall estimate that about 3% of young men in the Western Hemisphere have taken one or more of these substances at some point in their lives, including about 1 to 3 million men in the United States. So how are steroids typically going to be taken? So anabolic steroids are going to be taken in a variety of doses, in a variety of patterns, and in combinations. So generally, if you're like an endurance athlete, like a marathon runner, or you're a sprinter, you probably don't really need to be taking a lot of steroids. Part of the problem with building muscle is that building muscle generally is going to slow down your speed. I have certainly experienced this when I try to weight train while run. The stronger you get with your muscles, that's going to have an effect on your speed. You're going to slow down a little bit. So oftentimes we're going to find that endurance athletes, sprinters, they're going to take pretty low doses of steroids if they take them. But bodybuilders, strength athletes, like people who are doing things like weightlifting, shot put, etc., they may take up to 100 times the therapeutic dose. So anabolic steroids are often going to be used in patterns that are called cycling. So cycles are typically between 6 and 12 weeks long, and then they have periods of abstinence in between those cycles. Now, why would you want to cycle like this? There's a couple of different reasons why. First of all, you want to make sure that you're not really developing a tolerance. Additionally, you want to reduce the probability of adverse side effects. You're also wanting to maximize performance at a particular event. This is a little goal directed, and you want to make sure that you want to make sure that nobody is going to detect that you are taking a banned substance. So cycling is often going to be combined with something that's called pyramiding. So pyramiding is basically when the steroid dose is very gradually increased until the midpoint of the cycle, and then it's going to be gradually decreased as the cycle finishes. And the reason that people would want to potentially do this is because it reduces possible withdrawal effects that you may experience if you suddenly stopped taking steroids. In addition to this, athletes may use things like stacking, which is basically when you are engaged in simultaneous use of 2 or more anabolic androgenic steroids. So, for example, you're going to combine a short-acting oral steroid with a long-acting injectable one. And so you can kind of see a little bit of this. And another thing that we will talk about is what is known as bridging. So bridging is basically when you take a low dose to bridge between each high dose of that steroid. So here you can see some typical dosing patterns of different types of steroids here. So each line is going to basically depict a time-related, here in weeks, a time-related increase, and then decreasing in a particular steroid, sometimes in combination with another steroid. So here you can kind of see some cycling. So for example, this one is taken over a period of about 18 weeks. This one is taken over a period of about 10 weeks. So we have some cycling here. So here, this particular one in teal, oxymethylone, we have a cycle here, and we have another cycle here, and we have that period of abstinence in the middle. Additionally, you can see that all of these really have that pyramid structure. Also notice that we're doing a lot of stacking here. So oxymethylone is probably being taken in conjunction with some of these longer acting ones like nandrolone decanoate, as well as testosterone enanthate right here. So you can see a lot of that cycling, pyramiding, and stacking. And in addition to the different cycles that we see with anabolic androgenic steroids, other drugs may be taken at the same time, which is referred to as polypharmacy. So polypharmacy is basically when you're taking additional substances to either augment the effect of the steroids, to potentially mask or hide their presence, or to minimize some of the undesirable side effects. So to kind of give you an example, if you have like high doses of a diuretic, that allows a user to basically pass a urine test because the concentration of the banned steroid has been diluted below the limit of detection. So basically, if you're taking a very high diuretic that's allowing you to pass urine more often, that's going to drop the concentration of the steroid and thus will not be detectable in a urine test. So what you're looking at here, this comes from the World Anti-Doping Agency data. This comes from 2013, and this shows the relative percentage of banned substances that have been detected in positive doping tests that were conducted in 2010. So more than 60% of these tests included one or more anabolic agents, although as you can see, anabolic agents accounted for about 63% of what was detected. Another 10% went to stimulants. Another 8% went to diuretics and other masking agents. 6% went to glucocorticosteroids. Another 4% went to things like peptide hormones, growth factors, etc. Cannabinoids was another 4%, and all other adverse or atypical findings were another 6%. So now let's move on to talk about the pharmacology of steroids. So anabolic steroids are going to be a little different from the other drugs that we've talked about in this class because of their effect on muscle. Now, despite all of this, they are similar in their ability to produce adverse health effects and dependencies. So we know that there are some beneficial effects of steroids on muscle mass, but generally, there weren't a lot of properly controlled scientific studies that were really the people were finding. There was also some concern about placebo effects. Additionally, you could have increased training motivation or other confounding factors. But research in the 90s and 2000s basically found that giving high doses of testosterone to healthy young men led to kind of the following things. So increased muscle fiber hypertrophy, basically increased muscle size, increased muscle mass, and enhanced strength. Now, here's kind of the data from those studies. So this comes from Boston and colleagues 2001. So they were basically given weekly injections of testosterone enthate, at different doses for basically a period of about 20 weeks. So you can kind of see here the different doses of testosterone. So some were getting 25 milligrams per week, 50 milligrams per week, 125, all the way up to 600 milligrams per week. And then we have changes in thigh muscle volume, and you can see that really, first of all, 25 milligrams per week doesn't really seem to do much for thigh muscle volume. If anything, it decreases it. But higher doses of testosterone led to greater changes in muscle volume. And it also, particularly at the higher doses, led to greater leg press strength. So they found all of these different things, but what's kind of interesting, so remember that all of these are effects of testosterone, and we know that testosterone also plays a role in sexual function. What's interesting about anabolic steroids is that they largely work on muscles, and despite being similar in structure to testosterone, sexual function was unchanged. And so this aspect is not influenced by a testosterone level within the dose range that was used over the period of time of that study. Here's a few more pieces of data from the Bazin study. So again, here's our sexual function score. And again, you can see it's staying close to baseline. There's not really much of a change. Here we have changes in quadriceps muscle volume, and as you can see, higher doses lead to a greater muscle volume. So in general, what we have found is that anabolic steroids, they act like androgens. All anabolic androgenic steroids have androgenic action. They are agonists at androgen receptors that are present in many different types of tissues, including skeletal muscles. Now, here's the thing. In an inactive state, androgen receptors are going to be located in the cytoplasm of various types of cells. And what's basically going to happen, so here we have a cell, here we have an androgen receptor, and basically what's going to happen is that androgen molecules are going to diffuse across that membrane. They're going to go from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration, and they're going to bind to those receptors that are present in the cell's cytoplasm. Now, at that point, they're going to bind to that receptor, they're going to activate it, and that activated hormone receptor complex is going to basically move in to the nucleus of that cell, and it's going to regulate the transcription of different types of genes to basically, and ultimately, depending on the cell type, you're going to get different things. But with muscle cells, what we're going to see is that you're going to get an increase in overall muscle protein synthesis, particularly those that are concerned with muscle growth. Now, what are some other effects of steroids? So there are going to be some other effects that they do that help increase that muscle growth. So one is to basically increase the proliferation of what are known as satellite cells. Satellite cells are basically going to help form new muscle cells and developing muscle fibers. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to promote the differentiation of local stem cells, which are cells that can basically be turned into any type of cell, but they're going to be converted into muscle cells. And they're going to also inhibit the differentiation of stem cells into fat cells. So they're going to prioritize the growth of new muscle cells over the growth of fat cells. What are some of the side effects of steroids, though? And to be fair, there are a lot of adverse effects when people take steroids. So first, we're going to talk about physical condition. So we're going to largely talk about some of the different behavioral and physiological effects. So people can have abnormalities in heart structure and heart function. They can develop high blood pressure, and they have reduced HDL cholesterol. Now, for those who don't know, there are two different types of cholesterol metrics that you get when your blood is tested. There's HDL, which is sometimes known as the good cholesterol, and then there's LDL, which is known as the bad cholesterol. And so this reduces the good cholesterol that you need. As a result, there's an increased risk of cardiac death while you are taking these steroids. In addition to this, liver toxicity, that's going to be more common with oral steroid use. But liver toxicity can be an issue. This could include elevated liver enzymes in the bloodstream or even liver tumors. We also have some kidney issues as well, because kidneys play a role in kind of clearing metabolites. I love it when wellness influencers talk about detoxing. You have kidneys. You don't need to do a detox. That's what your kidneys are for. But we know that kidneys can also be damaged. You can have renal toxicity. And this might manifest in a mild, unsymptomatic form, basically characterized by elevations of things like creatinine and blood urea nitrogen in the bloodstream. And excessive steroid use has been kind of paired and linked to severe impairment in kidney function. Additionally, there are some other things that are very well known. These are anabolic androgenic steroids, and so occasionally there will be some masculinizing properties, even though some of these have been reduced. So you have a list of different things here. So we have our cardiovascular effects, so left ventricular hypertrophy, the heart becomes too big, abnormal cardiac structure and electrical activity, high blood pressure, decreased HDL, liver effects like jaundice, pileosis hepatis, so blood-filled cysts in the liver, as well as tumors, effects on the kidneys, elevated serum creatinine, not to be confused with creatine, and blood urea nitrogen levels, impaired renal function. It's also going to mess with your skin and your hair. So skin and hair problems are common. Acne outbreaks, such as you see right here, are going to happen. Oily skin and scalp, male pattern baldness. You are also going to get increased facial hair. This is, in addition to this, there can be some growth stunning in adolescence. Now, specifically for men, they are going to experience shrinkage of the testicles, reduced sperm count and possible infertility, enlargement of the prostate, and gynecomastia, or breast development. Bigger, stronger, faster has a different term that I will not share with you here. Check the documentary and find out what they call gynecomastia. For women that take anabolic steroids, they will experience menstrual abnormalities. You're also going to get some of those masculinizing properties, including the growth of an Adam's apple and a deepening of the voice, excessive hair growth on the face, enlargement of the clitoris, and decreased breast size. And for women in particular, the masculinizing effects may not be reversible. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the behavioral changes later. You will experience increased libido, potential mood changes like depression and mania, increased anxiety, irritability, and aggressiveness, body dysmorphia, and potentially dependence. So one of the things that if you're somebody that presents as very feminine and you've been alive for a couple of decades, you know how hard it is being presented with a particular standard of beauty that you may not necessarily fulfill. Well, something that's becoming increasingly talked about, which I think is very important, is that men are also being presented with a particular standard of masculinity that they also may not be able to live up to. And body dysmorphia can actually be pretty common in men, particularly men who are taking anabolic steroids. They may develop muscle dysmorphia, which is characterized by a false perception that the sufferer is weak and small. And symptoms may include constant checking of bodily appearance, dieting and excessive exercising, and compulsively using steroids to enhance their muscle growth. So we got to talk about the one thing that I haven't talked about. If you know anything about steroids, you've probably heard about the concept of roid rage. In particular, when I was growing up in the 90s, it was not that uncommon to see shows that were geared to teens and older children showing boys taking steroids to build muscle for a team and ending up developing roid rage. But the truth of the matter is that there's a pretty complicated relationship between anabolic steroids. Now, let's be very, very clear about one thing. Anabolic steroids are testosterone, and we know, if you've had me for biopsych, you know that there's a relationship between enhanced testosterone and aggression. And we do find that, at least for animal studies, they have actually found increased evidence for agitation, irritability, aggression, aggressive behavior, and violence. So here you're looking at a group of rats who are basically being presented rats that are being presented with anabolic steroids, or they're being presented with a vehicle. And you can kind of see that for the ones, we have attacks, bites, attack latency, and bite latency. And the critical area that's being injected into is the anterior hypothalamus. As you can kind of see here, the rats who are being given the steroid mixture, they attack more often, they bite more often, and they're faster to jump to those attacks, and they're faster to jump to those bites. Having said all of that, when you're comparing human steroid users with non-users, you do actually see some evidence for increased agitation, irritability, and violence. Now, having said all of that, outbursts of violent behavior, like what we would consider the roid rage, I believe Bigger, Stronger, Faster in particular is going to talk about a TV movie that had Ben Affleck as like a young adult using steroids and going into just a ridiculous roid rage. So you're going to see some footage of that, but there's not really a lot of evidence that roid rage in humans is common. Outbursts of violent behavior generally tend to be less common. Data on over 6,000 survey respondents from 2008 did actually find a statistically significant association between steroid use and violent behavior, like physical fights. But it's possible that there's kind of an issue here. Association obviously doesn't mean causation. But one of the things that we are going to find, generally, roid rage is a very rare event, even among very heavy users. And generally, the people who are going to be susceptible to that may already be susceptible to steroid-induced aggressiveness, or they're taking a variety of other different types of drugs like alcohol or cocaine that are really going to amp those things up. So roid rage is, while it can increase irritability and aggression and maybe even fighting and violence, roid rage is not really a thing. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the different circuitry of the hypothalamus and the different connections that are made, and you can kind of see why you're going to get anxiety and aggression in particular. So you can see here the anterior hypothalamus. Here's our aggression circuit that includes the periaqueductal gray. For those of you who have had me for biopsych, we know that that's an area for both predatory and defensive aggression. And then you have the anxiety circuit, and you can kind of see why people who take steroids might have an increase in both anxiety and in aggression. Now, tolerance can occasionally develop. There are some anabolic steroid users who do become dependent. In studies that involved about 426 users, about a third of them met 3 or more of the diagnostic statistical manual criteria for drug dependence, and as a result could potentially be classified as having a dependency upon anabolic steroids. But withdrawal can be pretty unpleasant. So withdrawal will include the following: fatigue, depressed mood, insomnia, restlessness, anorexia, so not really wanting to eat, decreased libido, dissatisfaction with body image, and obviously craving steroids. But one of the things that's really beneficial about steroids that you don't really have to worry about compared to other drugs, there's not really a euphoric effect that would really inspire people to want to really take these a lot. Or an intoxicating effect, and there's very little impairment in the performance of their daily activities. You're not really going to see that with any other type of drug that we've talked about. But we do know that they can be reinforcing. So animal studies have actually shown that either acute or chronic steroid administration does produce neurotransmitter changes in the brain's reward circuitry. Again, that dopaminergic mesolimbic pathway is getting involved. And we do actually find that animals will self-administer. They will also show place preference conditioning when they are presented with anabolic steroids. But much as we saw with stuff like GHB, they're not really as reinforcing as a lot of the other drugs we've talked about. Like, we are not talking about something on the level of cocaine or heroin, for example. So what you're looking at here are 2 different types of mice. These are what are called wild-type mice. They have not had any sort of genetic changes to them. These particular mice over here have been bred in such a way that they don't have functional androgen receptors. They are effectively testicularly feminized. That's why it's called TFM, testicular feminization. And so basically, they were trained to basically perform a nose poke response for an infusion of DHT, dihydrotestosterone, which is one type of steroid for every 5 responses. So one hole for nose poking was active. So this is the one that's associated with steroid delivery. One type, which is here in red, was inactive. So they looked at the wild type rats. They also looked at the rats that didn't really have the androgen receptors. And what you can kind of see is that the feminized rats are responding less than the wild type rats, but both of them do clearly prefer the active hole, and they're poking more often than for the inactive hole, kind of indicating that dihydrotestosterone does tend to have some reinforcing properties. So one other thing that I will mention is that anabolic steroids do have some therapeutic uses. They can actually be used to they can be used as hormone therapy. So the main if there are people who are assigned male at birth that have testes that are smaller than would be expected, this is when you would want to basically use that. So this is hypogonadism. And so this can include things like damage to the testes, certain rare genetic mutations, and additionally, there are several different diseases that can basically render the testes unresponsive to hormones like luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. And this is what is referred to as primary hypogonadism. In this particular case, the testes are not going to be able to produce testosterone, and as a result, you're going to need that replacement. Luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone are going to help that to happen, but in this case, the testes are unresponsive. You can also have secondary hypogonadism, which is basically based out of the brain rather than a problem with the testes themselves. So the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland isn't properly signaling to the testicles that they need to produce testosterone. So because of this, you can actually use anabolic steroids to get that testosterone into the body. So that does have a therapeutic use. So you can kind of see here, so here's normal physiology. So we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. They're going to release luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone to the testes, thus creating testosterone and thus producing sperm, very strong sperm. And this is basically, once that testosterone is out, we're going to get a negative feedback loop and we're going to cut production. In primary hypogonadism, the problem is with the testes, and thus there's not enough testosterone that is being produced, and thus that negative feedback loop is not occurring. In the case of secondary hypogonadism, the problem is in the brain, and as a result, very little luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone is being released. Compare that to the primary variant, where because we're not getting this negative feedback loop, we're getting massive amounts of both luteinizing and follicular stimulating hormone. Now, let's talk a little bit about why testosterone would be really critical and important. And to be very clear, women produce people who are assigned female at birth produce testosterone as well. It's just that they produce more estrogen. So testosterone is responsible for a variety of different things. This is why you would want this hormone treatment. It's responsible for things like sex drive. It aids cognition, memory, emotions. It helps produce hair and sebum and supports collagen production, so it keeps your hair shiny, it keeps your skin elastic. It produces hormones that increase red blood cell production in the kidneys, increases muscle mass and strength, maintains bone density, growth, and bone marrow production, and is responsible for sperm production, prostate and penis growth, and erectile functioning. So testosterone is really critical, and if you have hypogonadism, you may potentially run into these bodily issues, so that hormone replacement is going to be really critical. So folks, that is all I had for anabolic steroids. I hope you enjoy watching Bigger, Stronger, Faster, and I'll be back for the next lecture to talk about different types of treatments for mood disorders.